I've been remiss for years on discussing this topic. I've been asked about it a million times, that being the nature of the soul relative to fields in general. I've said in simple, and of course there's nobody, literally, with a PhD that can tell you, what's a field? Well, in simple, a field is an ether perturbation modality. Everything is either centrifugal or centripetal. Force and motion, inertia and acceleration is the conjugate geometry of the universe, which is the magnetodielectric. And of course, magnetism is just the dielectric field, loss of energy or inertia. Together they would make up, crudely, analogously, the yin and yang of the universe. Electricity, of course, is the hybrid of dielectricity and magnetism. If you actually understand what electricity is, explaining an electromagnet becomes really simple. The difficulty comes in discussing the field that is the soul. Mother Nature is really, really simple. We can't have fields over here, the ether over here. Of course, all fields, are ether perturbation modalities. You know, we've got the soul, and the soul's over here. Yeah, well, they're all one and the same thing. Well, what about individuation? Well, that's like, I don't know if you've ever taken a bubble bath. I haven't taken one maybe in 20 years, because, you know, I just don't take bubble baths. But you see one light in the bathroom, assuming you have one light, reflected. If you're looking at like a pile of soap bubbles, you'll see the same light like a million times in a million little tiny soap bubbles, right? If you're taking a bubble bath. Maybe the kind of the crudest analogy of the individuation of the soul. Then you have to explain incommensurability, because the soul is incommensurable. I'm not trying to use a fancy word here. You can look it up. The word is dendritic. The branching shape of lightning is dendritic. The fractal pattern of ferns is dendritic. Specifically, we're talking about toroidal dendritic being the geometry of the soul, but it's not a geometry that can put your finger on, because we have to overlay that with the manifestation of life. And once it obtains that form, which is not a form and not a specific rational platonic solid geometry, you know, it's not an icosahedron, you know, it's not a square, it's, you know, this is where the difficulty comes in talking about the field of the soul, because the soul is a field, but it's a compound field that is also too incommensurable. The vision of it in my mind that I've had for countless years is very, very simple. The issue comes in defining it. So is the soul as individuated, because everything is fundamentally, you know, one, undeniably so, because Mother Nature, not that there is a real Mother Nature, I've been attacked on that recently, not that I'm just using a metaphor here, not actuality that I think that there is a real Mother Nature, but Mother Nature doesn't deal in things that are a complete affront and insult to Occam's razor and simplicity, because simplicity is divinity. So the field of the soul, and by the way, I've been debating now from the ancient Pali this idea, and it's even found in Encyclopedia Britannica and all these places. You type in anatta, and anatta is just the Pali word for anatman. And I say, well, Buddhism is different, and the word Buddhism didn't exist until the 16th century. And this video, by the way, is in no way about Buddhism, okay? So bear with me for a second. No such word as Buddhism until the 16th century. Buddhism is different than Hinduism, and by the way, Hindu refers to a people, not a religion. Neither the Vedas, nor the Upanishad, or the Bhagavad Gita, or any of those other texts that you're familiar with is Hinduism. That refers to a people, not a religion. I've actually had a lot of Indians praise me about that. It's like, man, you're the first Westerner that understands that Hinduism refers to a people, not a religion. Yet Westerners are really, really mentally deflated, is the nicest way I could talk about it. But the word anatta or anatman in Sanskrit is both not a denial of the soul, but is a reference, of course, to the holographic soul. Everybody has dreamed, and there might be some weird person out there that may have never dreamed with some sort of a defect up here in consciousness, but basically 100% of people have. You know, things are vivid and palpable and demonstrable. The desires and impulses that actually feed human desires and ignorances and impulses and fears and, you know, all forms of satiate and insatiate desires, of course, are manifest. While the body is asleep, the mind, being full of desires, will create its own holographic reality. The ancient Pali word for that, by the way, is dibakaku, which means heavenly eye, but it means, you know, like holographic eye or a sleep eye. It doesn't matter what you mean. But anatta is, of course, a reference to psychophysicality. So when someone says anatta, we're talking about the holographic soul. It's kind of hard to explaining incommensurability to people is kind of difficult. And to be really crude, and this is still inaccurate, and this is the reason why I've not wanted to broach this topic for so long, is when you tell somebody, and their eyes, you know, dendritic, curvilinear dendritic being the geometry of the soul, but it's not a rational Platonic solid, as far as, let's say, well, you know, if it's dendritic, then it's curvilinear, i.e. it is toroidal. And it actually obtains this incommensurability. There's that word again, incommensurability. It's like, how do you explain incommensurability? Well, I can, but it takes like maybe 4 or 5 videos. Then someone would get it. Point non-specific incommensurability. Holographic paradigm where everything of the greater is found within the lesser. I don't know if you've ever seen a holographic positive. A holographic negative, excuse me. People are familiar with holographic positives, but a holographic negative, like you could have an entire sheet and then have the main subject here, but if you actually cut out the little corner down here where none of the image is, at least it's not visible there, and you shine a laser back through it, you can see the entirety in the part. So the entirety of everything is found within the part. So we're not talking about regular Platonic rational geometry. So I'm even hesitant to use the word geometry because we're talking about incommensurable geometry. But to keep it in simple, everybody knows what a torus is, i.e. a donut shape. Imagine a curvilinear extrapolation of the nature of the soul as being a dendritic toroid. And it keeps that even after death. It's like, well, we have a specific field that has no palpable or holographic, because life itself, of course, undeniably so, is holographic. This is the reason why the most repeated phrase in ancient Pali, for example, Rupa nata, Veda nata, Sana nata, Sankara nata, Vijnana anatate. Rupa, Namo Rupa anatate. The psychophysical is not the soul. Or we could say the psychophysical is the holographic soul. The demonstrable mass and magnitude with, of course, measure and magnitude and weight and all the things that are associated therein relative to the living soul. Old English was kind of neat that way. We don't talk like that in English anymore, like Old English or Shakespearean English, when we say, nary a soul was seen because the weather was so bad. We talk about psychophysical beings as a soul. Of course, every branch of metaphysics speaks of 2 different souls, the living soul, i.e. existential consciousness, which has its own geometry, a geometry that, of course, is palpable. But there is a geometry, and it is incommensurable. And it keeps that even after death, because once it obtains to that dendritic curvilinear, and curvilinear is talking about the extrapolation of a toroidal or self-reflexive dendritic. Just imagine lightning, because you've seen the branching. People need to look up the word dendritic. The branching of lightning, you've seen lightning at slow speed. Well, that would be dendritic. Well, imagine slow speed lightning in a toroidal form. What you see, and then on top of that, you actually have to say, well, that would be rational geometry. Everybody knows what a toroid is. A curvilinear essence, i.e. the soul, because that's what the soul is. The soul is a specific field. But then how do you explain non-rational, Platonic, incommensurable geometry that is the soul, this dendritic toroid, that also, too, maintains that? Kind of like when you pop a balloon, as the body were to perish, for example, the water still maintains its shape there for a while. It has that shape for X number of microseconds, but the actual geometry that is the soul, or the field of the soul, this curvilinear dendritic, which is the soul, the living soul. Once again, there's a living soul and there's a transcendent soul. Of course, if I smash the radio, then I have the signal. That itself, and it's kind of a near perfect analogy because the compound circuit of light is an incomplete torus. We talk about the transverse electrical magnetic and the longitudinal rarefaction and compression, which is a frequency. The signal, of course, must have a frequency because the body itself, and of course water is the antenna, the radio is the body, the battery, of course, is the food that we feed it to keep life, keep life around. Everything must eventually break apart. But we have two different souls. The soul as manifest with the shape, mass, and magnitude. But what about the soul that is transcendent? And of course the word ghost is incorrect. We should say disembodied being. But a disembodied being actually has its own geometry. But it's not a rational geometry. Rational transverse electromagnetic with the set frequency is rational, but there's not a single human being. Even the three-dimensional representations of electromagnetic radiation are still inaccurate. They're rational representations that a human being can wrap their mind around to understand it, but the geometry of the soul is irrational. Not irrational as in unreal, but irrational because incommensurability is irrational. Point nonspecific, holographic selfhood without the body. Because there are two selves in every branch of metaphysics. So curvilinear, dendritic. I'm not trying to confuse anybody, so when I say curvilinear, dendritic, and it being incommensurable, the vision of same is very simple if you're able to see it, but I dare say, and this is not meant to, to poo-poo anybody's understanding, but I think a lot of people, this is the reason why I don't want to talk about it, because a lot of people have an issue wrapping their brain around curvilinear, dendritic. Well, it's like dendritic lightning wrapped around a toroidal shape, but it is incommensurable. But why is it incommensurable? It is incommensurable because it attains to that because the perfect incommensurable geometry in the universe, that which was discovered by the Pythagoreans, and who knows before them, is tattooed on the back side of my hand, but this is two-dimensional. Now we have to understand this in three-dimensionality and understand what incommensurability is and understand how this dendritic toroidal, specifically is dendritic curvilinear, but to say curvilinear in full extrapolation is of course toroidal. So dendritic curvilinear incommensurable geometry. That's the geometry of the soul. And I say that with full mental awareness of it, and yet everybody else looks at me like, I just landed from planet X. Curvilinear, dendritic, incommensurable is this non-rational field of the soul. But it's no different than saying holographic. There's two different holographic cells because the signal ab extra to the radio is itself holographic. It has a footprint, a frequency, which is a cycle, and that cycle manifests and demanifests. And it is also, too, incommensurable. But when that signal interacts with water, i.e. the antenna analogously, we have something completely unique where we have the individual soul. And that shape, after the body drops away and the water representative or in collusion with that body drops away, then there is still that print of life which remains. The disembodied soul remains. I'm not trying to be obtuse. I did not want to broach this topic, but I hope I'm trying to make it a little bit more simple. And of course this toroid, talking about the signal now, not the signal as embodied in the radio, is expansive with desires and fears. If people wanted a true definition of hell, imagine a record skipping over and over and over again for 100, 200, 300 years. People think they've experienced hell on earth. They have not experienced any form of true hell. Then being a disembodied being that's full of ignorances, desires, and fears, and attachments. The ancient Pali word for this is called hungry ghost, and that's extremely appropriate because that's essentially what it is. So we have this retractive toroidal dendritic, i.e. the soul, which is liberated. It no longer takes upon itself the footprint of psychophysicality or existential life. Remember, once again, all branches of metaphysics speak of two different souls, the transcendent soul and the immanent soul. Bob, Sue, or Larry, the psychophysical entity, would be, of course, be the living soul. And it is still curvilinear dendritic soul. But when the falling away of the body occurs for whatever reason, that incommensurable field geometry that makes up this compound field that is the soul remains. Once you smash the radio, the signal is still there. In this case, we're talking about a reflexive signal where this life, represented by the radio here, is reflexive into the signal. Now, the signal, of course, affects the radio and how it tunes it and the gain thereof and the antenna, so on and so forth. But imagine a signal that is reflexive, wherein the radio itself, because it is a sentient signal, it's dendritic curvilinear, i.e. the geometry, non-rational, but hyperlogical actually, is reflexive upon the soul at the time of death. You see, the difficulty of talking about extremely obtuse dialectic metaphysics and talking about a curvilinear dendritic soul, which is hyper-rational, I mean, it makes people's eyes cross, and I don't want that to happen. I'm not trying to impress anybody with big words. You know, if everybody stopped the video and looked up picture examples of dendritic, like, oh, okay, I know what dendritic is. It'd become a lot more rational, but then, of course, you have to introduce the other element of incommensurability, and that creates a problem. So we have dimensional consciousness as embodiment. Non-dimensional or dendritic awareness, also too in Pali called dibakaku, or heavenly vision or heavenly eye. But it's no different than saying dream state eye. Everybody's been walking around doing all sorts of elaborate things and interacting with people and things in dream states. It's no different than to be in disembodied soul, where the soul and the body have parted. There was never a soul in the body, and there was never a signal in the radio, so it's kind of crude words that I use there, but everybody understands it. So this dream state desire based upon temporalization and the desires therein. Of course, living temporalization, which is dimensional and is holographic, no different than the ancient Pali word, which is highly accurate, anatta. Anatta is not a reification of this no-soul nonsense. 22 things are called anatta, meaning the holographic soul. Now, rupa anatta, vedana, the saying form is the holographic soul. Feelings are a holographic soul. Once again, we have this curvilinear, dendritic, irrational, incommensurable geometry that makes up the soul, where it is either expansive or it is contractive. Once again, remember, every branch of metaphysics says that the removal of modulation is liberation. It's either expansive or it is contractive. And that is very, very simple. Anybody could wrap their mind around that. So, embodied with water, of course, then we have empirical consciousness. But consciousness, by the way, the ancient Pali word for consciousness is so hyper-rational metaphysically. The word for consciousness is vijnana, which jnana is light or gnosis, and vi means inverse of it. Literally, the word for consciousness means illumination. In other words, it is directive, it is objective, expansive. In other words, existential consciousness is holographic selfhood. Ooh, isn't that accurate, huh? Why doesn't anybody talk about this? Of the several, well, not many ancient Pali translators. None of them talked about that. It's so incredibly important. But anything that, of course, is spatial is because of force. Ignorance, of course, has its own force. Ignorance in Pali and Sanskrit is no different than saying illumination. All force must necessitatively be dissipated. All force, of course, seeks termination in counter space. Counter space is kind of a ridiculous word. We could say subspace, the ether, 0 point. I couldn't care less what you call it. This is also true when it comes to falling in love. I haven't been on a date in years, but I kind of remember what it was like to fall in love. It's mutual acceleration. Every now and then the people will say being alone is a drag. You ever notice that if you have a supportive partner in life, that being together is easier? Kind of like two people that are back to back and they're leaning up against each other. They're actually mutually supporting each other. Genesis, of course, is union, but the nature of fields, no different than gravity and so-called magnetic attraction, which is not magnetism-based at all, is found in love as well, like true love, where you say, well, I love him and she loves me, or whatever gender. I couldn't care less about that. And well, that's one thing, and we're not talking about lust here. We're actually talking about genuine agape, love. collectively, you might have $0 and like, well, my partner supports me, he or she works and I don't, or vice versa. If all things being equal, say both people are out of work and both people don't have any money, the actual mutual support that exists, and this is no different than fields, the nature of the soul and the nature of love. Love is no different than saying gravity. It's like falling in love, it's just like gravity. I said, well, that's nice, except no branch of science has ever defined gravity. It's just very, very simple. Non-point source mutual mass acceleration. And to call gravity a force is completely ridiculous. Gravity is the total opposite of force. So is love, true love. I'm not talking about lust or desire. I'm talking about agape love, where you mutually support each other. Makes life a whole lot easier. Even though each one of you, one way or the other, may or may not collectively contribute anything to the relationship, money-wise or support-wise, it just makes life easier. I mean, that really is, you can debate me on that all you want, but I'm 100% correct on that. Anybody that's experienced that, I'm sure a lot of you have, probably actually, you know, he doesn't have any money, or I don't have any money, or she doesn't have any money, but together things are just a lot easier. And that's no different than fields are. Falling is the total opposite of force. To be alone is a drag, but it is also a drag in a field, because without that acceleration vector, all force and all matter, mass, and magnitude, including modulation of spirit, is literally a drag on the system. It brings everybody and everything down. You know, you can argue with me on that all you want, but I'm 100% right. Genesis, of course, you come together close enough, then we have Genesis, and easier being together, and of course this is bringing another life into the world, and once life is present, then it maintains itself. The genesis of life, assuming that's the first incarnation of that life, and it is not transmigrated, and the Pali word is punabhavati, which means again becoming. If it's the first genesis of that life, it perpetuates. So you've created something and brought something into this world, and of course it's incredibly precious from every branch of rational metaphysics. The same is true of art and photography. The only thing a picture had to do is either to stop you, impel you, or repel you. The net effect is the same. If it stopped you, then either a force or inertia was applied. If it impelled you, we're talking about inertia. If it repelled you, like the picture might be something horrific during a traumatic time of the Earth's history, like, you know, some conflict or whatever, you find it very repulsive, but it's a representation accurate of reality. You feel repulsion. This is no different than saying the magnetism of the soul. The soul is a geometry, but it is incommensurable, and it is not rational, conventional, Platonic geometry. It is curvilinear, and it is dendritic. And even after death, when the body and water has fallen away, it maintains that such that it is not life, as it was a disembodied soul, but it itself is now sentient because it is forever curvilinear dendritic being. You can actually say being or sattva, which doesn't necessitate it being a living being versus a disembodied being. So we can't say life. Once life exists, it always exists. Like, well, no, life requires body and water. Yeah, that's true, but I'm talking about life in the sense of metaphysics, where we're talking about being. Once it comes into existence, assuming it's the first manifestation thereof, it will maintain that in perpetuity. The unfortunate thing is that in perpetuity is also, too, the definition of samsara, which means to go round and round and round, which is, of course, the definition by the way of hell itself. So that's a problem. This is the reason why you ultimately want off of the roller coaster. I've not talked about this in any of the videos. I was always reluctant to discuss it. I've always thought to myself, how do you broach curvilinear dendritic being the irrational and incommensurable geometry of a soul? How do you do that? You have to talk about incommensurability. Why is it irrational? Well, it's not conventional Platonic geometry, like a cube or polyhedra. It's not that. Well, it is curvilinear, and extrapolation of curvilinear is toroidal, but it is also, too, dendritic. Well, people can look up the word dendritic and understand what that is. I mean, is this possible? Or is people just go, hey, I give up. These are big words. You're talking about incommensurable, irrational, curvilinear dendritic, being the essence of the soul. We could specifically say a field modality. Because electricity can be negated. It's just the hybrid consubstantiality of magnetism and dielectricity. So-called gravity doesn't exist. The phenomena, of course, does exist, but it's just mutual mass acceleration, point non-specific, no different than so-called magnetic attraction. So we have this conjugate geometry. Well, then, where then in life? Life must necessitatively be a field modality. Yes, it is. It's a compound and beautiful field modality, and of course, it's the most beautiful thing in the universe. And this beingness, not that beingness is a word, even exists after the body falls away. It exists in perpetuity because holographic field modality, that being the soul, is not reliant upon the body. It maintains that at the time of death, when body and spirit, of course, part ways. Of course, that is what life is. And the third thing that makes spirit and body union possible is, of course, water. This is talked about in the Timaeus, which probably was said by Pythagoras himself, and who knows before that. Anyway, I hope I didn't make your eyes cross or scratch your head too much. That was not my intent, but I wanted to talk about this subject. And thank you so much for watching, and I'll have a lovely weekend. Okay? Goodbye.